Okay, hello everybody. I am Erin Lindsay. I've just been finishing off my PhD in Trondheim in Norway, and this presentation is about the last part of my work for my PhD, and it's about landslides in C-band SAR backscatter change images. And this work is a bit different to some of the other talks in this session because we're looking at the backscatter amplitude or intensity part of the SAR signal, and we're looking for abrupt changes caused by landslide failures rather than the phase changes for monitoring landslides, which is more commonly used for INSAR studies. And there's two main approaches for detecting landslides and change images. The most common is to use optical imagery to detect vegetation loss, but this is limited by cloud cover. SAR backscatter images can be used to detect landslides through clouds. However, a major limitation is the speckle noise, which makes the images grainy and it's harder to interpret the images. So there's not so many people who have been using this approach. But for disaster response, using SAR images could potentially be quite helpful for identifying landslides and their consequences more quickly than is possible with optical images, because you can see through clouds, which is particularly useful if it's rain-triggered landslides. And this slide is about a previous study, about a technique we used in a previous study, looking at landslides triggered by extreme rainfall in Norway. Here we found that landslide visibility could be improved if you use multi-temporal composites or stacks of images for pre and post event to make change images. So starting here with an optical image, you see several landslides there in black with NDVI, while in SAR, you can see here using just single pre and post event images, you hardly see any landslides because of the speckle noise. However, if you use a composite, this is a median composite, then the landslides are significantly more visible, as you can see there in the bright green. So this case study had some surprising results. We saw that the landslides showed increased backscatter intensity, as you can see there with the time series plot. However, others had seen a decrease in intensity caused by landslides. But there was not really much literature available to explain why we saw the difference there. Yeah. So in order to get to the bottom of this, we did a global study looking at how landslides appear in SAR backscatter change images and what are the factors that control this. So in order to do this, we looked at a diverse selection of over 1,000 landslides from 30 case studies using the multi-temporal change images, which we saw before. Then we identified trends, relating these to the physical changes in scattering mechanisms, and then summarize the findings in a conceptual model. So I'm going to show some of the trends which were identified in the study. But first, some theory. So there are several factors which control backscatter intensity, and these are discussed more comprehensively in the article if you're interested. But a key one is the ground cover type and the associated scattering mechanisms. So here on this side, moving from left to right, we're going to see different surfaces that have increasing intensity from left to right. So starting with specular reflectance, you have a very flat, smooth surface, and almost all of the microwaves get reflected away from the sensor, and you get a very low intensity. For a bare ground surface, as the roughness of the surface increases, you get increased diffusivity. It's more bumpy and more microwaves get reflected back in the direction of the sensor. And at the higher end, at higher intensities, you have volumetric scattering caused by trees or other 3D structures. For C-band SAR, which has a 5 centimeter wavelength, trees are a quite good reflector, and most of the energy gets reflected back from the canopy, although it's scattered in different directions and the polarization, VVVH, can change. with VH being more sensitive to the change in orientation of the waves. And then you also have double bounce, which occurs off vertical surfaces. So then you get, that's the highest return when the waves bounce back towards the sensor off vertical surfaces such as tree trunks or vertical cliffs. And then you can also get a mix of these where you have thin vegetation or mixed or herbaceous vegetation, which is like non-woody vegetation. Yeah. For most, the differences are more sensitive. You can see it more clearly in VV polarization, which is copolarization, although for changes in volumetric scattering, this is more sensitive in VH or cross-polarized band. So starting with herbaceous vegetation, you can see some examples here of landslides in herbaceous vegetation. And here are the backscatter change images. You can see that the landslides appear in red, indicating an increased backscatter intensity. And this is also what we saw in the Norwegian case study that I showed before. Relating this to the scattering mechanisms, the microwaves mostly penetrate through herbaceous vegetation and interact with the ground surface below. So if we go from a smoother weathered surface to a rougher fresh soil surface, the increased roughness results in more signal reflected back towards the sensor and therefore higher intensity. And this is straightforward enough. So moving on in complexity, here we see examples of landslide deposits. On the left, you can see mud and silt deposits, and on the right, you can see rock avalanche deposits. In the SAR change images, you can see that the smoother deposits appear blue with decreased intensity, while the rougher rock avalanche deposits appear red with strongly increased intensity. Again, with some simplification, we can see that changing from a weathered soil to smooth deposits produces decreased intensity, while changing to rough deposits produces increased intensity. And this is largely, again, due to changes in surface roughness. Okay, and the next trend is about landslides in forest. You can see in the change images, the pattern is more complex. And this is most clearly seen on the right two examples. Here you see that one side of the landslide is blue and the other is red. And depending on if you are viewing from the left or the right or ascending or descending images, then the pattern is the opposite. So what is going on here? Why do you see both increases and decreases? So if you start again with the scattering mechanisms, we would expect that the change from volumetric scattering from trees to a rough ground surface would result in decreased backscatter intensity, particularly in the VH polarization, but clearly this is not the whole story. So we also need to look at the role of the geometry. Since SAR is side-looking, the geometry of surfaces is also important. Here we see a landslide scarp in profile, which has removed the forest and eroded some soil. On the side nearest to the sensor, you can see there's radar shadow, which produces very low intensity signal. While on the far side, the newly exposed tree trunks and lateral scarp produce both direct and double bounce scattering of the vertical surfaces. So for landslides in forested areas, the change in surface geometry produces strong changes along the edges of the landslide, while the change in the ground cover produces the change in the middle, like a slight decrease in V8. Okay, so to summarize, using the multi-temporal composites helped to improve landslide visibility in SAR change images by reducing speckle noise. This improved clarity allowed us to identify trends in landslide expression. We found that the main controlling factors were pre-existing land cover type and geometry. The different trends were presented as a conceptual model, which could help others know what to expect if looking for landslides in different areas with SAR backscatter images. Yeah, so this was a simplified explanation. And if you're interested to know more, then please take a look at the preprint of the article. and feedback is very welcome. And thank you for listening.